Hey folks, I'm taking this episode to advertise for other podcasts. If you enjoy stories about the people behind the technology that we use, you should check out the Greater Than Code podcast. They focus on the human side of software development with stories of diversity and inclusion, accessibility from people that you don't normally hear from. Search for Greater Than Code in your favorite podcast app or check out greaterthancode.com. This is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Amanda Silver. She is my boss's boss. She runs Visual Studio at Microsoft. How are you?
I'm good. Awkward way to introduce me, but good.
No, it's not awkward. I thought it was actually kind of cool because I was talking to my wife, who was the last episode, and she is a person I spend a huge amount of time with, and we talked about 2020, and I thought it would be cool to talk to you, who I also spend a huge amount of time with, about kind of the work aspect of 2020, because we had big, amazing plans, didn't we, as a group? At the beginning of the year.
We did, yeah. And I think we largely actually accomplished a lot of them, but it was a weird year, that's for sure.
In January, when we started out, January, February, March, that area there, I've been working for Microsoft now 13 or 14 years, entirely remote. Do you know, ballpark, just for your group and maybe for developer division, how many people were remote?
It's hard to, I mean, I know we can just, we could just do the numbers. I think it's about 40%, but it's hard to say because we have a number of like locations. We obviously have half the VS Code team is in Zurich. We have a lot of the Xamarin team is based in Boston. We have some folks in Vancouver. We have a team that's in Mountain View area. So, yeah.
Remote versus elsewhere, I think is different. So let's think about remote. So not based in Redmond, 30%, 40%, but actually like in their homes.
Probably before this year, I would guess it was probably around below 20%.
Yeah, it's below 20%. Yeah. And why is that? Did Microsoft prioritize in person, or is it just that the Redmond gravity just sucks people in? And like, I know that it's very collaborative. When I'm up there, I feel productive in front of whiteboards and in exciting meetings and things like that.
I think there's definitely a notion that Microsoft had kind of a culture of being in person is the best way to do things like brainstorming and other things like that, which I think has been totally turned on its head this year in a lot of ways. But I think the idea that there's this magic that happens when you're all in person. I think, Microsoft definitely had that kind of culture. And, as a result, even for teams that were based in Boston or based in Zurich or whatever, we would have them fly out, many times a year just so that we could have that high quality, brain time.
I think that when people who are remote working advocates like myself talk about how great remote working is, they're not trying to say that magic doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this is the thing that I find so incredible. So one of the things that we do as a division is we have this, we have a boot camp for anybody who's newly started on the team. When we're all in person, they actually fly out for 2 weeks. And the first week is introduction to Microsoft, introduction to the developer division, everything that we do. And the second week is our customer-driven workshop. And our customer-driven workshop is basically this really intense, kind of like a team project where you break up into groups of 5 to 6 people. And you're given a business assignment, kind of like, how could we double the number of Python developers using Visual Studio Code? And you work on that for 4 days. And you interview actual customers. And you come up with all of these hypotheses, and you basically do our product development process, which, starts with who's our target customer? How do we kind of progress through this? And what was incredible to me is that process, which I previously thought was only possible in person, because it's like we literally rent out a room that's, has 200 people in it or 50 people in it, depending on the size of the class. And it's, you get there at 8 in the morning and you leave at 6 p.m. at night, and you're basically doing like stickies on the wall the entire week as you collaborate with everybody. That's how you collaborate. And I've been so amazed that that has transitioned to be remote first. And it's better. It's better. I cannot believe that we actually took something like that was a brainstorming process that I thought was only possible in person. It's better.
Wow. So sometimes when I'm a remote, I am differently abled as a remote person, and I feel like I've got Novocaine in my fingers. Like I can't move my hands. I can't get anyone to listen. They're off on the other side of the room, and I'm the big head that's projected on the back wall. And I'm like, hey, people, my opinion is valid as well. But it could be bandwidth, it can be camera, it can be any number of things, and I feel like I'm not the same. Do you think it's because it's everyone is remote? Or do you think it's necessity as a mother of invention, or a little of both?
I think it's a little of both, but definitely a lot of everyone is remote. I think at first, when we first went from remote friendly to remote first in March, what I noticed was we went from having meetings where, you know, everybody would contribute and kind of speak up throughout the meeting, and we might get 40% of the attendees to speak up. We went to only two people speaking during a meeting, the person who was presenting and the person who was basically reviewing the material. And we had to essentially reboot the way that we thought about our meeting culture to actually make it much more inclusive. And because, I mean, if you think about it, if we go from 40 to 50% of the meeting participants participating to two people participating, that's a huge, not only degradation, but it's you're wasting people's time, right? I'm always like, am I wasting people's time? That's what I think about a lot. And I want to make sure that it's not just like we're broadcasting our opinions. It's actually that we're trying to tap into the collective hive mind to find the best ideas, basically. And if I'm only touching, if I'm only getting the feedback from really one person, then it's just I'm not getting enough out of it. So to move to something like that, where I can actually take six people who've never met each other before and get them to work super collaboratively on a new problem area that they've never worked on before, it's incredible. And the thing that's also really awesome about it is they are forced by nature of the fact that this is remote to actually create it as digital content. Whereas in the beginning, when we did it before, they would literally walk us through sticky notes on the wall. And it was great. They had fantastic ideas, but it was really kind of somewhat unorganized, and it was hard to be able to see, and retain and share out afterwards what these incredible ideas were that they came up with. But now, because it starts with this digital format by necessity, because everyone is remote first, we actually now have all of these things archived. We can come back to them. We can go back and actually see, what was the crispness of the thought, and pursue a lot of these things that we really weren't being able to pursue previously.
Interesting. That makes me feel like there must be some innovation coming in, not just in Microsoft, but generally in that whiteboard or analog to digital space. I know that Microsoft has been big on pen for a long time. I know that there are Surface Hubs that cost like huge amounts of money. There's got to be a quicker way to get what I just scribbled into a format that's more structured. And being
Yeah.
remote forces people to use OneNote and forces people to use Word.
Yeah.
But I remember times where there was. Go ahead.
Infinite canvases really help. We have also been using a product called Mural, which is not a Microsoft product, that we found to be very useful for this kind of collaboration.
I've used Figma for an infinite canvas of creative things when I do, complicated, like basically just a big space for us to all throw stuff in. And
Yeah.
it's unstructured, but it's mostly graphics and things like that.
Yeah, Figma is fantastic for UI design and kind of like conceptual art. And we use Figma in this process as well. But for the kind of brainstorming and organizing things like a lean canvas, or things like kind of working through these different problem domains, we found Mural to be really helpful.
So I want to dig a little bit into, you said that fewer and fewer people were getting involved. How do you fix that? How do you fix the culture? Because not everyone wants to turn their camera on. Not everyone has great bandwidth. There's a certain culture right now that we're seeing of people who are jumping both feet into remote, and they're getting ring lights and cameras, and they're
Mm-hmm.
upgrading their networks, and asking for a friend. And there are other people who are not into that. How do we keep a culture of equality while some people are turning their cameras on and thrilled about that, and other people are not, and other people that really want a high fidelity
Yeah.
experience, while other people just want to get their jobs done?
Well, I think, and you and I remember having this conversation as we were preparing for Build. It was kind of like, okay, well, how do we take this thing that we've done for, 20 years and we've always done it in person? How do we actually transition it to a remote only event? And I think the big epiphany for me was it's an entirely different medium. We just need to rethink it from the ground up as opposed to trying to translate everything that we had done in person. Like the idea that you're going to walk through a showroom and interact with vendors in the same exact way that you were before, probably not going to happen in that same exact way. And we can try to create facsimiles and things like that to kind of match it, but it doesn't really work that way. So we really need to rethink, like, how do we actually create these kinds of connections at every level for every kind of event? And so things like meetings, I think we've really had to rethink, like, what is the core structure of our normal planning meeting? For us, for example, in terms of planning, we usually start each semester, which usually happens in like January and July or December and June. We usually bring our LT, our leadership team, together for a 2-day offsite. It's like 16 hours in a physical room for us to discuss probably 6 to 8 different topics. And the idea to me of having virtual meetings with conference calls for 16 hours, 2 days straight. I mean, as much as I kind of still do that a little bit, but the idea of inflicting that upon others, it just felt like unnecessary, cruel torture. And so what we did instead is we actually we kind of had this conversation about what is the absolute minimum amount that we could do to get everybody aligned and on the same page. And we had a 2-hour OKR setting meeting, and we had a fantastic set of conversations. A week later, we had another meeting for that. But that was actually super effective. And then we've kind of reevaluated, how do we do things like communications to the team, like asynchronous forms of communication. And what we've found is that asynchronous forms of communication, whether that's a strategy paper or a short video of us talking about a certain topic, we found that to be much more effective because it actually allows you to talk to a much larger portion of the organization, and you can actually get more people aligned on it. So I think we've, in addition to changing the way that our meetings work and kind of why do we have meetings and what meetings do we have, we've also really tried to lean into asynchronous collaboration and asynchronous artifacts and things like that.
There's two things that I've seen and been involved in meetings with you and with your boss, with Julia, that I was impressed with. Was writing a paper. Like, we're really embracing writing it down culture. That's a big thing now. So it's like, don't just go and extemporaneously jabber for 3 minutes or 5 minutes. Go and write 2 pages. Make it clean. Make it tight. Turn it in. And then we were in a meeting last week for .NET 6 planning, and I was like, okay, we're all going to sit here and read this, because you're not assuming that anyone did the reading.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds silly. We're all going to call each other. There's like 20 people on the call. We're all going to shut up for 5 minutes. We're going to read this paper, and then we're going to talk about the paper.
Yeah.
It seems so obvious after the fact.
Yeah. And one of the best practices that we've started to adopt, and some other teams have started to adopt, is we actually have people put in their comments in the paper. And then the way that you do this in an inclusive way is everybody can obviously write comments in the paper. They don't need to be loud. They don't have to interrupt people to be able to write comments in a paper. And then we just go through the paper sequentially and look at all the comments. And whoever wrote the comment, talks about what they want, what they were commenting on. And we basically just work through it that way.
Another thing that you did was having people pre-record videos. Do they pay more attention? Like, what's the difference between me talking to you on video, like right now, versus pre-recording a video? Does one get more attention?
Well, a couple things. There's actually this has been a huge dynamic, even in the context of SLT meetings, like with Satya and his team. It used to be that we really valued live demos in person. We wanted somebody to come in and show the product and show typey, this is what happens. And a couple things happened when we went to remote first. First of all, and this even started to happen a little bit before remote first, but when you have a video of the demo and you show it off that way, it's actually kind of easier to direct the conversation. Because when you're doing a demo live, it can go in any direction. People can kind of ask about this point or that point or something else. And so that has helped. And the other thing is it lets people review it ahead of time. And so people actually have an opportunity to watch it a few times or watch, the 30 seconds that matter to them, over and over again to see if they actually do have a question about it. So it's kind of like this play replay aspect of demos and showing product. The other thing is you can also really, help to elevate the conversation to the right altitude given the audience.
Hey friends, you know how I love great podcasts, and I want you to check out the Code Newbie podcast. It's all about stories from folks on their coding journey. They talk to new developers, experienced developers, and everyone in between about how they got started learning to code, how they navigate their technical careers, and they also do deep dives into technical topics in a newbie-friendly way. Check out their podcast at www.codenewbie, that's NEWBIE.org/podcast. That's codenewbie.org/podcast. When you've held all hands lately, they're starting to become like almost little low-key television Saturday Night Live episodes, because there's like the opening with you, and then there's some pre-recorded stuff, and then there's maybe a guest host or someone comes in, and there's a screen sharing. It is more interesting, right? It is trying to also deal with just the sheer boredom of looking at a square all day long.
Well, I'm trying to live up to your standards, Scott. Which I'll never achieve. But I mean, I think, you definitely have to think about, if you have an hour or an hour and a half with people, how do you keep them engaged? It's not easy, especially if you're talking about something dry, like, I don't know, standards of business conduct training, which, by the way, obviously Microsoft has already started to understand how to make that engaging content. But they did that because it was such dry content at its core, right? They already figured out what you have to do to get people to pay attention.
That means we need more developer division telenovelas with a cast of thousands. We need to talk about that offline. Before all of this went down, we were already thinking about things beyond pixels and like live share, Visual Studio Live Share, the ability to share more than just my 4K monitor happened. Has that kind of thinking and products like that become more important? Like, was there any major pivots that happened?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, the research that we had been doing, for the last 4 to 5 years, actually, really centered on the fact that developers still need help and collaboration. And it all kind of centers on this idea of like, what does it actually mean to have distributed teams? I remember talking with one guy a couple of years ago whose business was growing, and his development team was getting so large that he was worried that he would have to rent a second room in the office building that he was in. And he was like really worried about this. He's like, I am not, growing from 12 to 20 people, no matter what the business demands, because I don't want to have to walk to another room to collaborate with the developer. Right. And I mean, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but then if you think about it, there is some aspect of all being in the same room that there is this incredible closeness that you get with the team that you're working with. But we saw that and we kind of said, well, why? Like, what is the core essence of what makes it so difficult to collaborate with somebody, even if they're in the same room? And, if it's somebody who's in another country or across the country, or in a different time zone. That makes it even harder. And so we started looking at this a couple of years ago, and we just saw that there was huge demand for better collaboration tools, even pre-commit, right? Like obviously, GitHub, Azure DevOps, all these DevOps products have really helped with the post-commit collaboration. But what do you do when you need help before you've committed? And like this is such an essential aspect of what it means to be on a team, right? One of the big struggles that we had this year going to remote first was onboarding interns, onboarding new employees for the first time. And there's so much that you learn through osmosis by being in the same room as, the rest of your team. So how could we replicate it? And what we found was that there are moments in the development process, things like the first time you're setting up your dev box, where you need a lot of help with your team to make sure that you're doing that in the right way that's going to allow you to contribute to the project. Another is when you're trying to debug an issue, especially if it's in an area of the code base that you're not particularly familiar with, how do you actually do that in a really productive way? Another is when you're writing code for the first time on a team, how do you make sure that the code that you're writing is adhering to the best practices of the team? And there have been a number of different studies, but depending on the study, it's between 25 and 65% of all comments on PRs are just style guideline comments. It's not functional feedback. It's that people want their code to look like they want your code to look like theirs.
I just realized that this is obvious to others, perhaps, maybe obvious to you, but if you're a new developer and maybe you're not the majority demographic, those style guidelines comments from senior developers that don't look like you could be, pretty stressful. Mm-hmm. And I would much rather a bot tell me those things so that it's simply a compliance hurdle that I need to, as opposed to being perceived as gatekeeping, because it's like every time I have a meeting with Amanda,
exactly.
It's like she hates tabs and I love spaces or whatever. And it's like a thing, right?
Right. Exactly. I mean, it was these three problems that led us to, in terms of DevBox setup, that's GitHub code spaces. That makes it so that you can actually have really consistent DevBox setup, that one developer on the team can basically standardize what a dev box looks like in a VM image or a container, and then you can share that with other developers. The live share is really about how can we collaborate on code that I'm debugging or that I'm authoring at this time. And even though you're in Portland and I'm in Seattle, we can actually look at the same exact code at the same time. And I can see your highlights. I can see your comments. We can actually share the debugging session together. And then IntelliCode, which is basically the thing that we've been working on to bring intelligence and really machine learning models that are trained not only on the corpus of all of the public code, but also like your specific team code that's private. We can actually understand that and create models and style guidelines that can help your developers, whether they're new or they're, if they've been on the team for years and years, basically conform to the rest of the code base.
In the past, and even as I used snippets, I want to say in 93 or 94 in Visual Basic 345, somewhere in there, where it's like, I want to do a for loop. I want to mess with a hash table. And I felt like that was magic. I was like, oh, the computer knows what I want. And it saved me 50 keystrokes. It feels like there's a Clippy out there somewhere that's going to say, it looks like you're iterating inefficiently over a for loop. Is that the kind of help that I want from an AI to help me not just write prescriptive code, but like more correct code?
Yes. I mean, I think that AI can help in many, many, many different dimensions of authoring code. The first thing that we're really focused on is, I think that there is an aspect of the conformance that, you'd kind of rather have that shifted left earlier in the process. You'd rather know as you're typing that, this isn't going to match the rest of the code base as much as you can, so that you don't have to have that intimidating PR comment from somebody else on the team. But there's also aspects of learning a new API. What I love about developers and why I love working for developers is they're lifelong learners. They're constantly learning new technologies, new domains. And a lot of times the way that you learn a new domain as a developer is you learn a new API that you haven't used before. And so what happens in really any API is there's best practices in terms of how you use that API, how you invoke that. So that is an example where we think that an intelligence can actually guide you through that process. Another good example is just the repetitive, the mundane, the tedious, the aspects that you do hundreds of times a day that, we could just make you faster and more confident as you're doing it. And then the other aspect is, things like regular expressions, which are the bane of my existence. I hate regular expressions because, no offense to anybody, but they're just a perfect example of a particular domain that isn't something that anybody has in their working memory. Maybe some amazing Perl developers, but
I think of regular expressions as being the Kubernetes of strings, where it's like, it's amazing and it's elegant and I never want to see it again. And I want you to hide it behind a checkbox.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a really great example where we can make it so that you don't have to know that particular subdomain of the programming language. And we can use examples and a kind of a guided experience to actually help you form the right regular expression for what you're trying to search for.
You said that you want to get rid of the tedious and the mundane. What do you say if a developer, myself included, is concerned that you're going to make me the tedious and mundane to be obsolete? I want an AI to make my job as a software developer easier. I don't want it to make my job go away.
The way that I look at it is we have an incredible shortage of developer talent in the world. Like in the US alone, prior to the COVID crisis, we had a shortage of over 1 million developers in terms of the available jobs, a software developer, and the available people that were qualified to fill all of those jobs. So I think there are a bunch of different things that we need to do to scale to the demand. And I also don't even think that the demand is truly representative of the demand. One of the things that we've seen over the past year, especially as people have had to pivot based on like the COVID crisis, there's huge demand for new digital solutions, new, tech solutions for curbside pickup or for telehealth, which is actually what my son is doing right now in the background. He's having a doctor's appointment. But that's obviously enabled through technology. There's incredible demand for all of these solutions across every industry. In fact, like the developer talent demand is higher in retail, in healthcare, in the energy sector than it is in the tech sector. So huge, huge, huge demand. So how do we respond to this? From my perspective, there's basically 3 different things that we have to do. One is we have to be able to create new developers, like mint new developers. How can we actually bring more people into the industry? 2 is we have to make developers we have to improve their velocity, whether it's, an individual developer kind of getting at what's in their brain idea to, the app as quickly as possible, or the way that they collaborate with their team. How can we actually make that much more productive and collaborative and dead on? How can we make them, serve the needs of their audience more effectively? The last is through collaboration, right? How can we allow development teams to collaborate with either other developers, whether that's open source developers or other disciplines that are involved in the creation of products, like designers or product managers or business analysts, or, we've talked a lot about people who are now using low and pro code solutions to kind of build new applications.
That sounds very much in line with what I was hoping you would say, and that's what I think I want to do. I don't want to say developers aren't needed anymore. I just want to not think about the boring stuff, because I like what you said. It's really about getting it out.
One second.
Oh, that's okay.
My daughter is she was sorry. I interrupted your thought, but she was.
Don't ever apologize.
Just one second. Let me close the door.
One time in a meeting, Amanda's, I think, daughter came in and sat on her lap, and that was really powerful. And we actually still talk about that because it's like, oh, the VP's kids, like, she's a person and she's a human, has like a family. Like, it's okay to have a family. Like, I don't have to freak out when my son comes in the middle of the day. Normalizing being a human being with family has been the best thing that came out of the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, not only have we gotten to know everybody's dogs and cats that step on keyboards all the time, but yeah, I mean, I feel like we actually are seeing each other as humans so much more than we did in the office, because we are seeing each other in in our personal habitats.
The irony that it took a thing that tears us all apart and puts us in our own little bubbles, and we haven't seen another human in a year, is the thing that made us feel human.
Yeah, it is strange. But I mean, I think it's also really cool that my kids are getting to see me at work. They get to see what I actually do. And they love coming into any video conference. And
well, after BBC Kid, every kid wants to be like marching in the middle of the meeting or whatever.
I've never shown them that video, and I do not plan to.
Yeah, don't do that. It'll be a thing.
Yeah.
All right. So in closing, when we all get back together, maybe March, maybe July, maybe 2022, what do you think your organization is going to look like?
Well, first of all, I've definitely seen us become more remote during this period, and obviously, like, everybody's remote nowadays, but I mean, people are actually making transitions to become permanently remote, because this situation has gone on for a really, really long time, and so that causes people to have enough time to kind of reevaluate their life decisions. And we have several people on my team, even on my team of directs, who have made life decisions to move out of the Puget Sound region during this period. So I think my team is going to be more remote and more distributed than it was previously. I think what I'm really hoping, though, is that we still have at least until July before we all come back into the offices, according to Microsoft policy at the moment.
July is the ballpark.
July assumption. Is the ballpark, and depending on how the vaccine distribution goes and all of that kind of stuff, it might be longer. And so this is an amazing period for us to really rethink, how do we get stuff done, and what do we really view as being essential in the office. And we now have a policy at Microsoft where you can spend up to 50% of your time working from home without even having to ask permission from your manager. And so I think we're just going to permanently have much more of a remote for first culture. And I think this is probably something that's here to stay for the entire industry. I mean, and so that has huge implications on the products that we build, because, at the end of the day, I build and you build products that people collaborate on to build software together, right? And if the industry is changing how that's done, where people are, how they're collaborating, then I think, we need to make sure that our products are responding to that. And so one of the big questions that I've been asking is, even on our own team, a lot of people have this idea that for us to be able to have a great conversation about something, we need to be able to go get beers. We need to be able to go out, see each other, have some, personal time, get to know each other as humans. And I think that is really true for software, right? It's not a lone solo activity that you do all by yourself. You're almost always collaborating with other people. But the question I have is, how can we actually make the humanity of it more front and center? How can we allow you to get to know the people that you're writing code with as a part of the product?
That is a really good final thought. I appreciate you hanging out with me today.
Thanks, Scott.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.